We meet at a very interesting moment. You know, on Tuesday, Pope Francis is going to be installed. And President Obama is not going. He's sending his vice president, Joe Biden, instead. The reason is that President Obama on Wednesday needs to be in Israel for meetings with the Prime Minister Netanyahus and for reaching out to the people of Israel. This is an amazing fact. There are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. There are tens of millions of Catholics in the world. There are tens of millions of Catholics in America. This is an important, if you excuse me for calling it that, political occasion. And the president is going to Israel instead. Why? Because this visit is not just a photo op or a meet and greet or an exercise in public diplomacy that could be postponed. This visit is a major moment on two vital issues. The first is Iran, and the second is the Palestinians. I think in Washington they are taking quite seriously the changes in Jerusalem. The new government of Israel that's going to be installed or announced this very day and will be installed on Monday has the same man at the top, Benjamin Netanyahu, but it has a very different composition within. The preceding government was the most conservative government in Israel's history. Actually, if you look in detail at the Knesset that we had for the last 4 years and at the coalition, the ruling coalition, it's far more conservative than the one that Menachem Begin headed, or the one that Yitzhak Shamir headed, or the one that Ariel Sharon headed. And it had a very strong policy, but it also suffered from poor relations not only with Barack Obama, but eventually with most of Israel's principal allies. I spent a lot of time in Germany. That's the whole story, and I've been there 10 times in the last 2 years, and I got to tell you, it's been a somewhat troubling experience. There are many friends of Israel in Germany, most importantly Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, but even she, who started out with a good relationship with Netanyahu, came eventually to be very critical. And the same for Sarkozy in France, and for Cameron in the United Kingdom. Israel has really suffered, I won't say isolation, but an erosion in all of its key alliances. And for Benjamin Netanyahu, this is a painful fact. I knew him quite well at one stage in his career when he was stationed in Washington. And I spent a lot of time with him, and I think I've got a feel for the man, and if you'll excuse me, I'd like to characterize him to you. Netanyahu is different from other leaders of the right in Israel. He has made the centerpiece of his career from the very beginning, anchoring Israel in the Western family of nations. In the first phase of his career, he wrote and spoke a lot, he's a very eloquent speaker, about Israel as a bulwark against communism. And later, he spoke of Israel as a strategic asset for the global war on terror and the struggle against Islamic extremism. In another phase, he spoke of Israel as the one democracy in the Middle East, as a country that could help to democratize the whole region, which would be a historic, change for the better. But always he spoke to cite the title of his book, about Israel among the nations. This is an unusual, it may sound like a platitude, but it's actually an unusual emphasis for a leader from the revisionist Zionist tradition, a follower of Zev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky's whole theme was a little different. Jabotinsky's whole theme was, we are alone. The Western family of nations does not really want us. We cannot trust them. We must rely only on ourselves. And the same for Menachem Begin and for Yitzhak Shamir. So here was a man in that tradition devoting his primary thrust, and yet when he was to anchoring Israel in the Western family, and yet when he's prime minister in the first term that just ended, the opposite happened, and some weakening of Israel's ties to its most important allies. I assert to you that this is not something that Netanyahu likes or wants or wanted to happen. He is now going to head a government with a somewhat different composition. Instead of a government of the right and ultra-religious, he is going to have a government of the right, yes, in partnership with the center-left. What the Europeans would call a grand coalition, one of these hybrids that is, it's a little contradictory, but it also permits more flexibility than a straight line ideological, all of one kind government. And if you look at the composition of the new government, a very substantial part of it is the center-left, and if they decide to leave the government will collapse. It will only exist with their presence. And what's more, no other government is possible given the numerical composition of today's Knesset. Only new elections. So we're going to see a very difficult partnership, but on the other hand, a partnership based on government guidelines that leave room for a different kind of diplomacy, which I assert to you Netanyahu actually prefers. It's going to be government guidelines which call, among other things, for an immediate resumption of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. These last 4 years have been the first 4 years in which we did not have any Israeli-Palestinian negotiations since 1989. And this has been a disappointment to President Obama, too. He's another one who has not had a good 4 years in the Middle East. If you remember, President Obama thought he was going to be the one to pick up, as he saw it, where President Clinton left off and complete a deal with the Palestinians. As a matter of fact, if you go back to his first day in office in the presidency in January 2009, he sat down in the Oval Office for the first time and he made 4 telephone calls. These were his first 4 telephone calls as President of the United States ever. And to whom were they? One was, in fact, to Netanyahu. One was to Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority. One was to Hosni Mubarak, at that time the president of Egypt. And the final one was to King Abdullah of Jordan. The point was symbolically to show that this was his #1 priority. Well, here we are 4 years later, and not only didn't he make any progress, it was actually regress in the last 4 years. What's more, he also made an outreach to the Muslim world, if you remember the speech in Cairo. But relations between the United States and the Muslim world today are worse than when he started. He thought he was uniquely suited to this because his mother married not 1 but 2 Muslim men, and he grew up partly in Indonesia, and everybody knows the story, and yet he was a failure in this regard too. And the third area was Iran. He also declared right at the beginning that he was going to use the tools of diplomacy and try to achieve progress with Iran, where he criticized George Bush for failing to use the tools of diplomacy, and he was going to accomplish more. Well, things are worse with Iran than they were before. They've doubled and doubled again their production of rich uranium, and they are far closer to a nuclear weapon now than they started. I'm not saying this is Obama's fault, but it's a matter of record that this didn't work. They want to get the United States team that is landing in Israel on Wednesday a new start. He has a new Secretary of State, John Kerry, who, by the way, was a critic of Obama's confrontation with Netanyahu over settlements. Not because Kerry loves settlements, which he doesn't, but he thought it was unhelpful and was not going to work to have a public confrontation over this. And he thought it was a bad tactical approach, as he said publicly. If we had more time, I would read you an actual statement that he made publicly. And that's John Kerry. And Kerry's going with him to Israel. Anyway, I need to be very brief because we want to hear Alan, but so I'll compress this a little bit. But the point is that the president wants to come to an agreed common set of approaches with the prime minister, and the prime minister wants to do the same thing. Just an hour ago, I was approached and I did an interview with a journalist, and all he wanted to know is, how big a fight are Netanyahu and Obama going to have? And he wanted to ask about tension, tension, tension. He's way off. That's not what this is about. It's not that it's going to be a love-in. It's going to be a dialogue between allies about mutual problems that they both face, and ideas, some of which are not completely identical, about ways to handle it. On Iran, The United States is hoping to have as much remaining time as possible to avoid the use of force, because the use of force is not the best choice. And if we can somehow stop the Iranian nuclear weapon by an agreement with the Iranians. Now, the Obama team has become pessimistic about an agreement with the Iranians. They are not at all confident that it's going to work. But when you talk to them privately, what they say is the Iranians are finally feeling the pain. Their oil exports have been halved in the last 12 months. Their government revenue has also been halved. The rial has lost 80% of its value. They have lots of problems. Let's give this a little more time if we can. Netanyahu actually agrees with that. But the problem that Netanyahu faces is that we are approaching the Iranian, what Abraham called zone of immunity. There will be a moment, not very long from now, where it's too late for the Israeli Air Force to put a stop to the Iranian program, because they will have crossed a certain line. Obama agrees with that. There is a thing called the zone of immunity. But the zone of immunity from the United States Air Force is more distant moment in time than the zone of immunity from the Israeli Air Force, because the United States has far more aircraft capable of reaching Iran, many more weapons choices, far greater payloads, more points of access, more intelligence, more of everything. And we don't have time here, but if you looked at this in detail, it's day and night, the capability of the U.S. It's not surprising. One's a global power and one's a very impressive, but regional power. So the American zone of immunity starts later. But this is a very tough situation. You're saying to a prime minister of Israel, let's remember, Israel was created to make a Jewish decision about Jewish destiny without depending on others. And you're asking a prime minister of Israel to depend on a foreign country for Israel's basic security, something Israel never wanted to do. You know, Israelis often say very proudly, we never asked one soldier to die, a foreign soldier to die for us. We fight for ourselves. That's the whole point. But on the other hand, Netanyahu is also an intelligent man, and he knows very well that if Obama were to do it, he'd do a much better job. What's more, if the United States did it, the Iranians would know that the United States could come back the next day and the day after that. This is an important difference, because when the Ayatollah Khamenei has to decide on his responses, it's one thing if it was Israel, which can't really come back a second time, and it's quite another thing if it's the whole U.S. Air Force and Navy that you're staring at. You're staring down the barrel of the American gun. It's not a small thing. And he will be very constrained, which means that the Iranian response will be more deterrable in the event of an American. Now, last week, Vice President Biden went to AIPAC and said, Barack Obama is not bluffing, which were great words. And the president himself has been very firm. He said, I will prevent, I will not allow, again and again and again. The problem is, there are no words left in the English language that the Obama team hasn't used. But the fundamental problem is that very few people believe it. I bet most people in this room are going to shake their heads and say, I don't believe it. And I can tell you that in Jerusalem, the majority don't think the U.S. is going to do it. And most important of all, in Tehran, they don't think the U.S. is going to do it. If they did, they wouldn't be acting like they are. So there's a credibility problem here, and words alone can't solve it. They've been very firm in their language. This is going to be a tough discussion of Iran because both sides are right. It will be most unfortunate if Israel has to do this alone. But it's very hard for an Israeli prime minister to say, okay, I won't do it, I'll lose my opportunity, I'll go into the zone of immunity and I'll trust you, when there is so much doubt. It's going to be very difficult. But you can also see why it's so important to leave as much time as possible. You know, I'm in a bit of a dilemma. I think I've used up my time.
You've got 2 more.
And I want to say a word about the Palestinians, no small matter. Look, it's fashionable to say it's hopeless with the Palestinians and so on. But the trouble with the Middle East is all solutions stink, including the status quo. And the status quo is not a good one. I know there are those who disagree with me, but My own view is, and much more important than my view, I think the view of most Israelis, and I think the view of Benjamin Netanyahu, is that this can't go on forever like this. What's more, I think that Netanyahu thinks that the left will come back in Israel someday. Sooner or later, there's going to be a prime minister of the left, and that prime minister is going to sign a piece of paper and declare peace, and then we won't be safe. I'm not speaking of my view, I'm speaking of what I believe is his view. He certainly, to say the least, doesn't trust the left to negotiate an agreement, a safe agreement with the Palestinians. And it may be something that most people in this room doubt, but I firmly believe it's the case that Netanyahu wants to be the one who signs an agreement with the Palestinians, because only the Likud can. That was their campaign slogan, and what it means is that only the Likud can arrange a safe solution. And a safe solution is not the same as the status quo, because the status quo is unstable. So I make to you the controversial assertion, I'm just back from Israel, I spent a lot of time with very key people there, that the world's going to be surprised. Netanyahu is serious. He wants to sit down with the Palestinians. It's not just that he's being dragged in there kicking and screaming. There are going to be difficulties, great difficulties. But he wants to do it. And what he wants to do is to come to not a final status agreement, comprehensive, end the conflict agreement that solves all problems, because that's a bridge too far right now, starting where we are. He wants to sign an interim agreement that creates a Palestinian state with temporary borders. What that means is a more truncated Palestinian state. It has disadvantages from the Palestinian point of view, but it has advantages too. Disadvantages because they don't get everything they aspire to, but an advantage. They do not have to sign away the right of return for an interim agreement. The single hardest thing for a Palestinian prime minister, it may seem obvious to you and me that these so-called 5 million refugees are not going back to Israel, but it doesn't seem obvious to them. And it is considered treason in the Palestinian world to sign away the sacred right of return to the homes of our fathers and all of that stuff. So a Palestinian prime minister who doesn't have to sign that part of the agreement will find the agreement much easier to sign. It was the very part that stopped Arafat, that stopped Mahmoud Abbas in the past, and they don't have to do it for an interim agreement. Israel, for its part, doesn't have to sign away certain things either. Israel doesn't have to withdraw from at least all of the lands of the Bible, the hills of Judea and Samaria. Israel does not have to have that final horrible moment. Israel also doesn't have to completely partition Jerusalem. There might have to be an administrative capital for the Palestinian temporary quarters in Jerusalem, but not a line on the earth, and certainly not the Temple Mount and the Western Wall and so on. So it's a much easier agreement. It's still quite a difficult one, by the way. We don't have enough time to review the difficulties, but it's a more attainable goal. I can tell you that in Washington, people have come around to a similar view that an end of conflicts, all in one grand scoop, the grand bargain, is a bridge too far. It's not going to happen. Let's concentrate on the doable. Politics is the art of the possible. And so you're going to see a sobered up, realistic approach with much greater American-Israeli cooperation on this issue, and a resumed effort to restart Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. I could say a lot more about it, but I really don't want to eat into Alan's time any further. I thank you very much. It's really been an unbelievable experience to be here.
Thanks.